In the 1970s, our homes weren't just places where we lived. They were expressions of our individuality and personal freedom, featuring design choices that might be considered daring even by today's standards. Reacting against the cookie-cutter suburban homes of the 1950s and early 60s, the 1970s embraced experimental ideas in a rejection of uniformity and a celebration of individuality. Settle in for a trip back in time as we take a tour of some of the most iconic home trends of the 1970s. Some are forgettable, some are regrettable, but all are certain to bring back warm memories of the experimental spirit of the 1970s. Stepping into the living room of the 1970s, your foot would likely be greeted by the unique sensory experience provided by the soft, plush texture of shag carpeting. Thanks to advancements in the development of synthetic fibers and manufacturing techniques that made it possible to efficiently and affordably produce the long, dense fibers required, shag carpeting began making its way into homes across the country during the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, maintaining the look of this type of carpeting would require more than just vacuuming. Periodic raking would be required as well, and if you ever dropped anything like a pin or the back to an earring, you may never find it again. The 70s vibe didn't stop with the shag carpeting under your feet. It extended all the way up the walls through the extensive use of distinctly patterned wallpaper. Prints during the decade were colorful and bold, frequently featuring geometric patterns or floral and botanical prints. Colors were rich with a particular emphasis on earth tones like avocado green, mustard yellow, and burnt orange. Sometimes the wallpaper didn't even end when the wall ended. It just continued across the entire ceiling as well. Some wallpapers incorporated outdoor scenes, aiming to bring the tranquility and beauty of nature inside. In decades prior to the 1970s, the living room furniture might have been arranged to best facilitate conversation, with the small TV rolled off to the side or placed in a corner. With advancements in technology and the increasing popularity of TV in the 1970s, the television became the focal point of the room. No longer was it just an electronic device that could be wheeled around on a cart. The television was now a significant piece of home furniture. In the early 70s, a decent 21-inch console color TV would cost about $500, which would be like $3,500 today. The wood cabinet of the TV would have been selected to match the other furnishings in the room. Often, the top of the TV would have been used to display family photos or other knickknacks. Also located in the living room would be the console stereo. And I'm not talking about your older brother's Kenwood component system stacked in the case with the glass door. That wouldn't come along until the 80s. The 1970s stereo would be mounted into a long, low cabinet made out of wood. Doors on the front would swing or slide open, or a section of the top would be lifted up like the hood of a car. Inside the cabinet would be a turntable, a stereo receiver, and an 8-track tape player, along with built-in storage for your records and tapes. 2 big speakers would be built in on the front of either side of the cabinet and would be covered by some decorative threaded fabric. As huge as the system would be, the only controls would be a radio tuner dial and possibly a bass and treble adjustment. There was no graphic equalizer and probably only one volume for both speakers. For the family that preferred live music, they might even have an organ sitting along the wall. When I think back to the 1970s, I can remember organs being kind of a thing at the time. We had a Lowry organ store at our local mall, and there'd always be some guy in a suit playing the organ and enticing people walking by to come into the store and talk with the salesman. I'm not sure if organs were purchased as smaller alternatives to pianos, or if they only sold to Lawrence Welk fans, but I can see the appeal. Look how cool this thing is with all of those light-up switches. For homes that were really trendy, they might have been lucky enough to have a conversation pit. Now, these weren't simply the sunken living rooms that lots of homes had in the 80s and 90s. These pits were multiple steps down, integrated into the design of the room, and had comfortable seating lining the perimeter of the pit, creating a dedicated spot for gatherings and conversation. The middle of the pit often featured a low table or fireplace that added to the ambiance. While definitely innovative and unconventional, conversation pits could also prove dangerous for young children or elderly people. They're essentially a big hole in the floor without a railing. I'm sure they led to some unexpected injuries at those swanky 70s parties. And it's too bad, too, because they really looked fun. A form of an above-ground conversation pit, so to speak, might have been created with the modular furniture that was also popular during the 1970s. Depending on how you arranged these sectional pieces, you could create a nice setting for a group conversation, or if there's anyone you'd like to keep out of the conversation, like maybe your daughter and her dolls, Apparently, that can be accomplished too. Now, for the super swingin' bachelor, there was also the Playpen brand of modular furniture. You can see it's no secret what they were selling here. And if you weren't swinging enough for the Playpen, or swanky enough for the conversation pit, there's one more iconic sofa option from the 1970s, the Hide-A-Bed. Couch by day, guest bed by night. The sofa sleeper was the perfect piece of furniture for that era when relatives would come to town for a visit, but oddly never considered paying for their own hotel room. Anyone who traveled to see their relatives during the 1960s or 70s has probably slept on one of these things at least once. And what did you use for a blanket? Probably the granny square Afghan that was draped across the top of the Hide-A-Bed. Granny square blankets somehow seemed to find their way into every household and were usually found draped across the backs of chairs and couches. While kind of itchy, these blankets were good for wrapping around your shoulders or throwing over your lap when the evening cooled down. One room in every house that maybe fell victim to some of the most experimental decorating trends of the 1970s was the bathroom. Let's start with the flooring, specifically carpeting the floor of the bathroom. Carpeting offered a way to extend the design aesthetic of the rest of the home right into the bathroom, all while keeping those bare feet warm and comfy. But why just stop at the floors? Well, there are so many other blank surfaces that could also be covered. At first, it was just the toilet lids that began to be wrapped in fuzzy covers, perhaps with a matching floor mat. Then came coverings for the tank lids, and you know what? While you're at it, why not just cover the entire tank? The carpeting got so extensive that some bathrooms began to resemble the interiors of custom conversion vans of the same era. How many people remember the colored toilet paper of the 1970s? Colored toilet paper offered a way to extend design choices, allowing homeowners to match their toilet paper to their bathroom's color scheme. Eventually, it was found that the dyes used in colored toilet paper contained unnecessary chemicals that could potentially harm the environment and septic systems, not to mention cause allergic reactions to people with skin sensitivities. The novelty of colored toilet paper soon wore off, and the colorful rolls were soon replaced by the practical white style that we still have today. Adorning the walls of homes in the 1970s was an eclectic selection of items that seemed to be everywhere back then, but are rarely seen today. One of these items was some type of multi-gauge weather station. Typically, this item had 3 dials, one for the temperature, one for the humidity, and one for the barometric pressure. While the gauges seemed to be functional, these things really served no purpose other than decoration. Fancy versions of this device were made of real wood, while many, like the one in my house, was only a wood veneer. Speaking of fake wood wall hangings, does anybody else remember seeing these battery-powered wall clocks paired with matching candle sconces? We had a set in our house for the longest time when I was a kid. When this set was finally taken down after several years of service, I remember the 2 dark green candles ending up in the trash, having never even been lit. It's as if we had gotten so accustomed to seeing these candles as mere decorations that no one even considered keeping them to use as actual candles. The rise in popularity of do-it-yourself projects and crafts in the 1970s led to a variety of homemade art pieces making their way onto the walls of homes. String art kits fit perfectly into this trend. String art used colorful threads or metal wire wrapped in patterns around nails that were hammered into a wooden backing. Popular patterns were birds, ships, or geometric designs. It was a fun craft to make, and when it was done, it could go right up on the wall. Macrame was another popular craft that was found throughout homes in the 1970s. This creative art of knotting cords or string into patterns to form decorative items allowed people to personalize their living spaces through handmade crafts. They were used to make room dividers, plant hangers, window coverings, and decorative wall hangings. Of course, none more popular than the macrame owl, usually perched between 2 pieces of natural wood. The bedroom walls of teenagers in the 1970s were decorated by a new kind of art form, the blacklight poster. These posters often featured colorful images of rock and roll bands, famous musicians, or any other variety of psychedelic scene. Blacklight posters were relatively inexpensive and could be purchased at several stores, though the best place to view them lit up by UV lights was in the poster section in the back aisle of Spencer's Gifts. Another poster that made it onto the walls of millions of homes in the 1970s was the famous photo of Farrah Fawcett in a red one-piece swimsuit. Farrah in her swimsuit became one of the most iconic images of the decade and a symbol of 1970s pop culture. This poster was purchased by millions of admirers and found its way not only into the bedrooms of teenage boys, but also onto the walls of their father's den. Well, at least it did in my house. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to stay with me a little longer and extend your time travel journey. Just click this next video.